equity, and dignity. We as an institute remain committed not only to remembering the revolution, but more importantly, bringing its spirit into policymaking that can actually deliver on the vision of those who have organized, protested, and imagined in the years since. But the Egypt of 2011 is certainly not the Egypt of today in 2026, and that's what we're here to discuss. We have with us a brilliant group of panelists who will unpack this context and lay out a policy agenda for Egypt in 2026, which is clearly, given the aforementioned, shaping up to be an important year for the country. We have with us my colleague, Tim Kaldis, Deputy Director of TIMEP and Adjunct Professor of International Relations at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Dr. Nancy Auquel, President and CEO of the Center for International Policy, and of course, former Executive Director at TIMEP, and Samar Al-Husseini, Executive Director of the Egyptian Human Rights Forum, an independent human rights organization that works to promote and protect human rights in Egypt and to support Egyptian human rights defenders in exile. They all have remarkable bios, and you can read them in full on the website. Today's event is going to be a moderated discussion. We'll do 2 rounds of questions for the speakers to lay out the landscape, and then we'll turn to audience Q&A. If you're joining us from the audience, I invite you to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll turn to your inquiries at that point. So let's get started. Samar, I'm going to begin with you. At the beginning of this year, like we said, Egyptian authorities announced the final results of the country's elections for the House of Representatives after what was an unusually contested election season. Can you tell us a bit about what happened, why these elections, and why this House of Representatives is so important, and what does this broadly tell us about the state of politics in the country?
Okay, hi, thank you, Mai, for the question, and thank you, Tahrir, for taking the initiative to gather us to try to unpack what's happening in Egypt. It's really confusing to everybody, even for us. About this elections, let's start by naming things as it should be. We cannot call this an election. It's a new level of a pre-engineered elections. I would even go further and say that it reminds me a lot of a simulation model that I participated in my college for the Egyptian parliament, where seats are assigned. People are known ahead that they will be representing certain groups. We have a so-called opposition. We have a so-called supporters of the regime. The elections is the longest in the history of Egypt, modern history. We didn't have a parliament elections that lasted that much, and we didn't have as corrupted and as fraud elections as this one. I started my career as an election observer. I've been doing this since 2005, and I can very clearly say that this is the worst ever. The level of I wouldn't say money, or it's okay to use money to campaign, but when money is the tool to buy the seats, when the prices of the seats are announced publicly on social media and on national TVs, this is an alarming situation. This is I wouldn't call this a House of Representatives that represent the will of the people at all. Even though with all this attempts for elections, I think there is a bunch of people that we can call them a representative of the people. People who fought the fight, went to the streets and tried to campaign and get votes and people to vote for them. But other than this, it's lists that has been assigned by the security apparatuses. And it started actually with the electoral law itself. It's a law that was not welcomed by any of the political party. It's a law, parties in Egypt, it's a law that undermines the idea of elections and free will. And although this was supposed to be one of the outcomes of the national dialogue, and was supposed to represent an overwhelming desire for a political reform in Egypt, or even to indicate that there is a possibility for political reform, this didn't happen in these elections. The current parliament, if we're gonna call it, we have We have only 53 members whom we can call parliament members who are from the opposition out of 568. This is an insignificant number. And there are others that call themselves independent, but we all know the game of independence, independent members in Egypt. After a while, they will switch to one of these sides. And we have another thing that is significant in this elections also and in this parliament, that many of the heads of the committees are actually assigned by the president himself. And the chairman of the house is assigned by the president himself. So it's really an unprecedented case where the chairman of the house is an assigned member. It's not an elected member. This election also has another element. People saw this as a good indication, but it's also a scary indication. When the president intervened in the middle of the election process, saying that I don't like what's happening. And we agree with him, we didn't like what's happening, but as the head of the executive branch, it shouldn't have came from him. It should have came from the committee, the national committee that is assigned to monitor this election and work on it and monitor what's happening. So it was a will from the president for this parliament to be more representative, but again, it's also an indication of the imbalance of powers in Egypt. Why this parliament is really important, I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks. This is, I will call it the constitutional amendments parliament. We're expecting this parliament to amend the constitution. This term supposed to be the last term of President Sisi. We're not sure that he is ready to give up power yet. I don't think he will be ever ready to do this. So the speculations, and there has been already some indication from it is this parliament will amend the constitution. It will allow the president to have more terms. I'm not sure how many, because if we're talking very technical, he was supposed to be out 2 terms ago, because the constitution has been amended in 2019, which allowed the president to stay for more. And now everybody is hoping that this is the last term, and we were hoping that the international scene, the international environment would support this idea or this right that the president give up power and someone else would come to the presidency. But I think Nancy would cover the international aspect fully, so I don't need to go to that. But we can say that the president feel comfortable. He feels that he can amend the constitution. Internationally, he is accepted. There are several partners of Egypt that are welcoming his steps, and that sees in every single step that he's doing as an accomplishment, as a progress, starting from the law, the Criminal Procedure Code, which is a law that was supposed to dismantle a huge crisis in Egypt. But at the end, it ended up legalizing every violation that we were mentioning before. Reaching out to these elections where international partners said that they're happy that the president intervened in order to make sure that the elections going in the right direction. So it was an election to be marked in the history of Egypt, and I'm sure we can go back to the repercussions of this later. Thank you, Amay.
Thank you, Samar. Lots there to unpack, whether it's the security and executive interference in the parliament, and just kind of a representation of just how pervasive that representation now is in what's supposed to be an independent legislative branch. And of course, the importance of this parliament, given that it will have to make the decision, quote unquote, of whether or not to amend this constitution to allow President Sisi to serve beyond 2030, as some people are reflecting and wondering about. Tim, I want to come to you next and bring the economy into this. And of course, the parliament, by the way, is going to play an important role in any economic legislation. Just a few years ago, Egypt was on the brink of economic crisis. Recently, however, the country's credit rating was upgraded, GDP growth seems to be increasing, and inflation seems to be trending down. How is the economy doing now? And maybe more importantly, how are everyday Egyptians actually living and experiencing the economy?
Thanks, May. I think it's important to capture kind of what we're really observing, in that it's not that the Egyptian economy has improved structurally in the last few years. It's that there was an enormous amount of financing given to Egypt in early 2024 in the midst of regional crisis. So when in the midst of the genocide in Gaza, there was a kind of a shift in terms of attitudes with respect to financing Egypt and requiring reforms, because in the years preceding, the IMF was quite strict on reforms. The Gulf partners were also more demanding on reforms. However, once we get into the end of 2023 and then the start of 2024, there's more prioritization of stabilizing Egypt and worrying about reform later. And so we see this massive $57 billion bailout. It's a combination of the money from the Emirates for Ras Al Hikmah, pledges from the European Union of 7.4 billion euros, an expansion of Egypt's IMF loan to $8 billion and later $9 billion, and a pledge from the World Bank of $6 billion. And so this huge injection of cash did a few different things. For one, it stabilized their ability to repay their debt, hence the credit rating rising. And because of that, there was a renewed interest amongst investors in debt to come back to Egypt, and the hot money, so the short-term debt sales increased. And so there was inflows of roughly $30 billion of hot money into Egypt since then. And all these things have increased the liquidity in Egypt. But in the process, Egypt dramatically devalued the currency. And that sparked a really deep expansion of inflation that was already happening even before then. And while inflation currently is much less than the 30–40% figures that we saw during the earlier crisis, it's still well above the targets of the central bank, roughly double the target of the central bank at around 12%. And it's important to recall that inflation is cumulative. So what we're seeing is not that prices are coming down, but that the deterioration of people's purchasing power, their cost of living challenges are only worsening more slowly. But it's also, they're absorbing that 30%, 40% shock that they felt in 2023 and 2024. And so overall, they're still suffering a lot. And it's reflected in the fact that we see Egyptians trying to leave in record numbers. So the arrival of irregular migrants in Europe, the second largest nationality is coming from Egypt, not directly from Egyptian shores, but Egyptian nationals. And so that's reflective of kind of not only a deterioration in the economy, but also a loss of hope that it's going to get better anytime soon. And fundamentally, what we're seeing is we're also seeing this in the numbers in terms of food insecurity. So the Food and Agricultural Organization shows that food insecurity has been steadily rising for the past decade. Moderate to severe food insecurity is over 30% of the population right now. The government has stopped publishing poverty data altogether. And the newest loan program with the European Union actually explicitly does not require the Egyptian government to publish poverty data because they know they don't want to. And that's a reflection of how bad poverty has gotten. And so we're conservative estimate, maybe 40% of the population is in poverty. And so we have all these kind of real challenges for the population, and we haven't addressed any of the structural flaws in the economy that got us to this point. So we have this dynamic by which the inflow of cash has reinforced the idea of the leadership that they're too big to fail. that whatever happens, they'll get bailed out again. And so as a result, we're not seeing any real meaningful increase in tax revenue. Egypt's tax to GDP ratio is less than 13%, whereas amongst its peers in Morocco and Tunisia, it's double that. And in the Article 4 that the IMF put out, so it's a report reviewing the economy and its dynamics and what needs to happen, the IMF complained of two pretty huge problems. One is that fiscal policy is not actually visible. So what the government is spending and borrowing, because there's so much off-books transactions that it's hard to really know what the state's resources are going to and to what extent. And then the other problem is that the pound that is supposedly floating does not have the volatility of a genuinely floating currency. And so the result is that the IMF is saying that they cannot have credible visibility on fiscal or monetary policy, which are the two pillars of economic reform, which means you have a reform program that's built on a house of cards, it's built on straw. And if it is the case that these fundamental issues haven't really been addressed, and there's all this kind of off-books transactions and surreptitious manipulation of the currency, then we're going to continue this boom-bust roller coaster that Egypt's been on for the last decade. If you look at the GDP, for example, of Egypt, it went from $351 billion when the IMF started in 2016 to $349 billion in 2025. But in the process, it dropped and rose anywhere from $250 to $475 billion in that period. It's been a wild ride the population has been taken on, but fundamentally, we're not seeing the kind of economic stabilization and sustainable growth that Egypt needs. And the debt is really on unsustainable levels. And basically all of the savings that happened after Ras al-Hikmah in terms of reducing the debt has since been erased. And Egypt has basically the same level of debt it had when the last crisis of debt at around $165 billion right now, external debt. So we have a debt crisis, we have a huge inflation built into the population, rising insecurity in terms of food insecurity, and the private sector is still largely in a state of contraction with occasional indications of a month of growth here, a month of growth there, but out of the last 100 months, maybe 10 or 12 show actual private sector growth. So there's a lot of major structural problems. But I fear that without kind of being convinced that reform is necessary, that those problems aren't going to be addressed.
Thank you, Tim. And we'll come in the next round of questions. I want to ask you a little bit about kind of what reforms and what's actually required. But thanks for that. I think it's really essential. Oftentimes, a lot of folks who are paying attention to Egypt from afar are perhaps looking at the big indicators without understanding the larger context and what that actually translates to on the ground. Nancy, I want to come to you next, and I want to bring you in on foreign policy. In October, Egypt hosted a peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh for Gaza, and in 2026, it's expected to play an even more prominent role in what comes next. We also recently heard that Egypt has joined the Board of Peace. How do you expect Egypt to position itself among competing pressures from the US, but also domestic sentiment of everyday Egyptians on Palestine? What's on the agenda when it comes to Egypt's role on Gaza? Nancy, sorry, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Mai, for inviting me to speak with you and Samar and Tim. And before I start, I mean, I have to mention that, I mean, it's the 15th anniversary of the Arab Spring, particularly 2 days ago, Egypt's revolution. And I mean, like by any objective means, I mean, it's like the failure of the revolution is something that people, and the defeat, something that people always talk about. But I think, I mean, it's just like just seeing TimeUp and the leadership of you and Tim and how you're keeping it as a platform for alternative, I mean, views and perspectives from the region is admirable. And the revolution didn't have leaders and still doesn't, but it does have the different like spaces that is actually holding ground and holding space for understanding really what's happening. I mean, listening to both Tim and Samar, and I'm learning a lot, and this is great. So congratulations on the work that you're doing. And similarly with organizations in Egypt, it's like from Madam Nasser to other civil society organizations that keep going despite all the pressure. So this says something. And I'm saying this because what is happening to small organizations is not what's happening to countries of the region. They are struggling even more and finding it more hard to keep it together. And as you said in the beginning, May, the Egypt of 2011 is not the Egypt of 2026. I would say the same about the world, but I would even say the world of before 2023 is not the world of today, and the US of before January 2025 is not the same as the one today, with all the precarity that come with the second presidency of Donald Trump. Let me just make an observation, is that we cannot talk about what's happening in Egypt and the region in separation from what's happening in the US, not in terms of foreign policy, but also domestically. I didn't imagine that I'll ever say this, but hearing Samar talking about the uncertainty of whether there are going to be elections or not and what's going to happen, I mean, and that's very familiar conversation right now domestically in the US. People sometimes say it in a sarcastic way. It's like always says, like, when the election comes, whether there is election. The fact that this is being spelled out in the US is something. The same thing also with things that we've seen that was like shocking for us in 2011, that using the military against the American people and the killings of protesters in Minneapolis. I mean, we just saw the second killing on video a couple of days ago. All these things is just not to say that the US has become an authoritarian regime or anything. There's still a lot to be, I mean, destroyed, that Trump is like going towards it. But the familiarity of what's happening there to what we have experienced for a long time in the region, in Egypt and elsewhere, is not just about the US losing its moral ground. It had lost its moral ground a long time ago. However, the role it's playing right now in terms of the pressure it's putting on countries takes a different shape than it was before that. And I'll come back to this point, but looking at the dynamics in the region, since 2011 and before that, the North Star of every state and monarchy in the region and the guiding, I mean, direction and compass is to preserve their regime autocracy. This has been the goal number one. It identifies, I mean, it determines like which countries gets funding and money and grant. It determines which countries get isolated in a blockade, like what happened in Qatar. And then also it determines which like rifts are happening now that we're seeing surprising between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates right now. So in all these cases, the determining factor is preserving their own autocracy. And this is not to be confused with preserving sovereignty, because those are actually two opposite things. And with what Tim was explaining, for example, is like the grants that came from UAE that kept Egypt afloat and from the rest of the Gulf since 2011 is what kept it afloat. But the high dependency and Egypt being a vessel for the Gulf, depending on like which country weighs more, is putting Egypt in a very difficult position than it has always been. I mean, it's just like, of course, I mean, Gaza and the genocide in Gaza is making things difficult. But something has shifted also. It was always seen that the Israel-Palestine conflict narrative serves the regime. It's like there's something happening out there that is like it's a priority. We'll get to that, and then we get to like the small issues at home. Now it's actually the narrative has flipped, where what's happening in Palestine, seeing the killing, the constant blocking of food and medicine and just like any humanitarian aid is actually creating that pressure on the government, putting it in a very vulnerable position. Now, this vulnerability is only going to increase now because of the different recent conflicts in the region. And I'm going to go a little bit back to June of 2025 when Israel launched strikes over Iran, and then America did the same. And then after that, in September, Israel launched strikes on Qatar. And this has been a turning point and actually probably helpful where that ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire that we are seeing right now happen, because there has been always a common knowledge or conviction in the leaders in the region that the United States can always reign in Israel. I mean, there is some sort of a control, despite like its power and military and everything, but there are things that were red lines that are not going to be passed. And they did pass it, and they did pass it without the usual green light, or at least the public green light from President Trump or the President of the United States. Now, this takes me back to the point that Samar was talking about when the president of Egypt came and said he doesn't like what's happening in the parliamentary elections and the infighting. And this is basically a representation of impunity. It's like when you're always thinking you're in control and you own everyone, but when your boys start fighting, I mean, that you don't want that. I mean, I don't want you to stop because I don't want any just bickering. And that's what Trump said about Iran and Israel, for example. I mean, when he said like there was a point he's out of the airport and commenting on what's happening is like, they're both crazy. I don't want this. I mean, so this is a reflection, and I'm making these comparisons between the international arena and what's happening domestically in the U.S. and what's happening in the countries of the region, is to lead into what we're going to talk about in the second round, is like how the international order has changed and how would that affect Egypt. I mean, we've seen in Davos the speech that was admired by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, who was like commenting that we've always known, I mean, like that the international order was not equitable, and people were just like really admiring what he said. But actually what he said is like what we have known for a long time. And what the Europeans in the West knew for a long time, but they thought it will never affect them. They thought, I mean, like now that it's coming to NATO, now that it's coming to Greenland, and they feel they're on the brunt of it, now they're acknowledging it. So all the work that we used to do before on Egypt in terms of putting pressure for reform, what Tim has mentioned, I mean, like what Samar was mentioning, is like from the Europeans and from the US, is completely a different calculation. And the most perilous position of Egypt is its lack of sovereignty and its vulnerability to all the whims of those changes that is becoming more precarious than before. And that's because, I mean, the lack of democracy, the lack of independency, the lack of transparency, increased corruption, and the inability to really build a stable economic and political position for Egypt in this big storm that we're seeing in the world.
Thank you, Nancy. And I'll stop you there because we're going to come back to you in the second round. But I think you lay kind of a global context that's helpful for us to understand, and situating Egypt and some of the pressures that it experiences specifically on Gaza domestically versus the whims and kind of changing global order as well. There's a lot there to unpack. Tim, I want to come back to you. Now that we diagnosed the state of the economy and we talked a little bit about how folks are experiencing it, I want to ask you practically, what's next and really what should be next? If you were advising the Egyptian government on the economy in 2026, what would you recommend that they prioritize? And how would you advise that they approach future funding agreements, like a future IMF deal, for example?
Thanks, May. I think fundamentally the challenge is that Egypt's economic problems at their core are political. And I mean, to Nancy's earlier point, there is a kind of prioritization of the regime's interest at the expense of even the state's interest or the public's interest. And getting away from that is very challenging. So, I mean, in theory, I mean, there's a number of things Egypt could do that would improve conditions in the economy in terms of improving rule of law and the reliability of contracts and the predictability of the market. They could reduce the privileges of companies owned by the military and general intelligence services that are eating up market space and also intimidating people or and whatnot, and also draining the state of funds. They could make sure that all the transactions and expenditures of the state were transparently recorded and rationalized. They could make the customs efficient, but a lot of these things are at odds with political objectives, because, for example, the inefficiency of the customs, for example, something that Egyptian officials and ministers have been talking about for decades, privileges military-owned companies because they're not subject to customs, for example. When I talked about taxation, there's a major flaws in the state's capacity to collect taxes. Tax levels are very low, so what is the result? There's no revenue. They have to keep borrowing. But the military has exempted itself from virtually all forms of taxation. And while officially legislation has required them to now pay taxes, the IMF pointed out over the summer that we haven't seen any real change in the share of GDP that's coming in as tax revenue that would reflect a massive economic player suddenly paying taxes. So there's real doubt that that's actually happening. And of course, because military companies' books are considered a national security secret, we have no visibility on whether or not they're paying anything. But they are taking, for sure. And so we have this dynamic where the state is a resource for the military economically, but the country's economy as a result suffers. And I mean, in addition to that, I mean, people have been trying to get them to spend more on public services, education, and healthcare, as required by the constitution that Sisi passed. Those are important not only for the public well-being, but for economic growth. Actually, they're really critical in terms of building up people's capacity to do higher skilled jobs and bring in and strengthen the labor market and the productivity of the workforce and grow the economy. There's lots of things that the government should be doing, but I think fundamentally, as long as the leadership feels that they can continue to get bailed out whenever they run the country kind of into the ground, economically speaking, I don't think that they're going to do it. And we saw that even when they were on the verge of that. So if we look at 2023, Egypt was listed by Bloomberg as the second most likely country in the world to default. The IMF had stopped paying out dispersals of its loans because it failed to do the reforms that were agreed to. The Gulf states started to withhold the investments that were anticipated, and the country was running on fumes. The central bank was just deposits from the Gulf almost entirely, 85% of the reserves. There were shortages of medicine and other vital goods because they had to strangulate imports to conserve what dollars they could to repay external debt. And despite all of that pressure, they wouldn't budge on reform. And so I think the real challenge going into the end of this year, when Egypt's latest IMF loan, I think the fifth now or something like that, comes to a conclusion, and we still haven't seen we've seen zero growth since the IMF started 9 years ago. Are we going to continue this trend where we bail them out, have no reforms? The population suffers, tries to flee if they can, either through normal channels, regular channels, or irregular channels, and poverty continues to deepen. And I think that there's a real risk that we're going to continue to do that. In the last round of financing, speaking to a lot of officials across Europe and the United States, there was a real reluctance to be serious about reform. And one diplomat told me that they fully expected Egypt to fail to implement the reforms that they were agreeing to, but now is not the time for pressure. And my concern, though, is that in the midst of cuts to foreign assistance globally and extraordinary demands for foreign assistance in the region, right? Rebuilding Syria, rebuilding Lebanon, rebuilding Gaza, hopefully rebuilding Sudan. Next time Egypt needs a massive bailout, will the money be there? Because last time it cost $57 billion. How much is it going to cost this time? And who wants to pay that bill? I think it's a real question that unfortunately a lot of policy planners are kind of kicking down the road, and everyone is putting in a little bit, hoping that everyone else will keep putting in enough to bail them out and stabilize them, and not default. But the problem is that as much as, like, for example, Nancy mentioned that Egypt owes all this money to all these countries and, depends on them. It's true, but it's a double-edged sword, because all these countries also have investments and loans that they need to recuperate their funds on. And so Egypt kind of also, if it's left to actually financially collapse, they could lose quite a lot as well, and that creates a lot of risk for them. And so their fates are kind of intertwined together. And I'm not sure that we're going to get out of this cycle of boom and bust in the next round. But if people want to avoid a bigger crisis eventually, it would be really prudent to start getting serious about reform. And also, Egyptian leaders want to genuinely know what it's like to feel like independence, and to start to really be able to have some sort of power in the regional landscape that isn't so precarious and fragile and vulnerable to external economic shocks and external patrons. Then they need to stabilize the economy in a sustainable way. I have my doubts that they will.
Thanks, Tim. I actually want to give you one more minute to just lay it out, kind of, if you were advising the Egyptians again, what are the top 2 or 3 reforms that you would say they need to start with? Just very simply. I know it's not a simple question, but kind of to take this from the Egyptian perspective, I think
a critical thing would be that Egyptian military companies, I don't realistically expect them to disappear or withdraw from the economy, that they no longer be a burden on the state, meaning that they pay for all of their own real costs. They don't get subsidies. They don't get to use conscripted labor that the state pays for. They pay for all of their inputs, and they pay their taxes, because that's a huge bucket of money, not only that's coming out of the state, but also it's a profound kind of black hole in terms of understanding what the state's finances even look like, how much debt really exists out there, a lot of things, and also cease to utilize the state for creating work for themselves, like the new administrative capital and the longest monorail in the world and all these things. That is a big thing. Investing in substantial progressive taxation on high income earners, on luxury properties, second properties, capital gains, to really start to ramp up revenue so the state can reduce its borrowing and start to repay debt, and move away from kind of this persistent debt crisis, is another major important area of work, and not doing it to the public. Because if you rely on regressive taxes, you're going to cause more inflation and depress domestic demand. And that means that private sector will not invest and will not create jobs and will not grow. And then the other thing, if I'm going to pick one big third thing, is real investments in social protection and public services. The education and health sectors have suffered immensely. Social protection, the poverty levels continue to rise, and the amount that the Egyptian government is spending on social protection declined from 0.5% of GDP to 0.4% of GDP. And we're seeing the results in people being hungrier and harder. It's harder for them to put food on the table. So real investments in much more robust universal social protection systems, universal health and education systems, and quality there. I think those are key things for stimulating growth, stabilizing the economy in the long term, and starting to create more fiscal health on the part of the state. And if I can have a bonus, a real rule of law and an independent judiciary, so that contracts can be enforced credibly, that people can actually predict what's going to happen when they have a business deal, and a press that can actually report on the dynamics, so that consumers and investors alike know what's happening in the country.
Thanks, Tim. That's perfect. Very clear kind of places to start, so that we don't kind of keep falling into the trap that it's too big and where do we even start in these cycles of dependency. Nancy, I'm going to come back to you. We spoke in the last round of questions on Gaza, but also the larger global context. But of course, that's not the only foreign policy priority on Egyptian officials' desk this year. Egypt continues to play a prominent role in places like Sudan, and recently we heard that President Trump has vowed to bring Egypt and Ethiopia to the negotiating table on the dispute around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. How should Egyptian officials be thinking about these foreign policy files and others in 2026? And what do you imagine they're thinking about, particularly amid the shifting geopolitical landscape, shifting tensions between the Gulf, and the changing world that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, at the risk of continuing to admire the problem and just like going back to what has changed for Egypt and the role it used to play in the region and beyond. And for a long time, I mean, it was known that Egypt had its mediating role between Israel and Palestine, and it was seen as the stable country in the world, as they always say, and that's a problem also that Tim would always say and talk about, like the claim that Egypt is too big to fail. And he just like said it in like more eloquent words, but I mean, if you owe the bank $1, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank is in trouble. And that's what's happening with a lot of people who's got investments there. Now, I think, I mean, it's just to be honest, I think the position that Egypt has taken and putting their foot down on refusing completely the displacement of Palestinians into Sinai is really a positive direction and a positive point for President Sisi. However, he's not doing it for the Palestinians. He is understanding very well that Egypt cannot have the political legitimacy domestically that would protect it from any lash out from something that happened if, well, first of all, if the Palestinians get displaced, which is going to be considered by Egyptians and the rest of the Arab world as a betrayal. Second, also the competence and ability to contain that. They know very well they wouldn't have, and a mistake can happen. Someone would be killed, and Egyptians are killing Palestinians. I mean, so this is a positive thing, and this is like some form of the semblance of sovereignty in terms of decision making, and actually there was a lot of pressure on Egypt to change, just like using the stick and the carrot in many ways. I think also, I mean, it's just like it's important to mention that what's happening right now in terms of mentioned in the first question, and I didn't get to respond to you, is like the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh and Egypt coming to be part of the Board of Peace. And I mean, the instability in the region is an instability for Egypt. I mean, and vice versa. I mean, again, like no one wants Egypt to go into chaos because that's going to affect the entire region. However, we really need to be serious about what we mean when we say, I mean, the ceasefire and what we mean by the Board of Peace and the summit and what Egypt's role in that. If we're serious and honest, when we talk about a ceasefire, or over 400 people have been killed since that. I mean, I don't have the exact statistics, but that doesn't look like a ceasefire for me, except that the Israeli side is killing people in Gaza. So that's the first thing. Now comes to the Board of Peace and its charter. Because this is a move from the side of President Trump to sideline the UN and create another structure that substitutes it. Now, not that the UN was like really functional. I mean, 2 years of genocide and nothing happened. I mean, that tells you a lot. However, this shift is really critical, and it's different in quality of the way the US practiced hegemony in the past, because in the past, the United States, I mean, adventures and overreach has been done by the state and for the state. And right now, what Trump is doing is privatizing foreign policy. He's creating his own foreign policy or diplomacy enterprise to replace the UN for his own personal interest, rather than for what is even falsely claimed in the past for the interest of the United States. Now, what this means is that, first of all, a lot of people are dismissing it. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't have any forces, it's not going to do anything. It is actually very dangerous. And because of that, because the move towards privatizing it, plus, I mean, if you look at the charter of the Board of Peace, it gives them ultimate power. that outlives his presidency. So even if he does not become the United States president, he is, I mean, he claims himself to be the president. Now, Egypt joined, and I think others, I mean, if you also look at the collection of countries that accepted the invite-only kind of border peace, I think it's mostly authoritarian, with few exceptions, mostly authoritarian regimes and monarchs. And I think, I mean, I would not blame Egypt for accepting being part of that. And it's a strategic, I mean, like the world is learning that, I mean, if you challenge Sisi here, you're going to get like a punitive action that is not even expected, as the European did. Now, Trump had a clause in the charter that you either pay a $1 billion and become a permanent member, or you lose your membership after 3 years. So the safest bet for countries like Egypt and others, I mean, there must be other calculation, is that they would join without paying, and then their membership will, I mean, it's just like expire in 3 years anyway. And that's safer than challenging Trump or saying they're not going to be part of this. However, when push comes to shove and we continue on while Egypt is a member of this board of peace, and we see the continuous escalation in the region, the pressure on Egypt is going to be domestically and regionally more acute. Now, talking about even signs of functionality, I mean, in terms of practicality and operationalization, like the General Jasper Jeffers, who is heading the international security forces that is being formed to secure Gaza, is actually the same one who is heading the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire agreement. And you see how this is going. So, and why is that? It's not about this particular general is failing to do the job. It's because of the structure. If you look at the charter, and if you look even about the documents of the, sorry, the summit, I mean, there isn't a single word about accountability. And that's exactly why we continue to be in the same cycle we've been for decades ago, because we think that we're just going to move on, water under the bridge, all the genocide and everything is just like going to be come to a halt, and we're going to have like this nice board that is going to pour investments in an imaginary way, which is, again, like it's not far away from the same structure and logic of the Abraham Accords, which again failed to, I mean, at least obviously as we see it as like the number of countries in conflict within the region just over the past 2 years has increased like really significantly. And this is because, I mean, like the whole assumptions that we're on the level of the Abraham Accords, I mean, that is like arms for peace and peace through strength and selling more arms to countries just to marginalize the issue of Palestine, wishing it away. That doesn't happen. The same thing is happening with the board of peace, except again, that notion of the privatization of foreign policy under President Trump and how he is using his own power. So it's going to be very difficult for Egypt to have predictable, I mean, it's just like next steps. And that's true for the whole world. But the best thing, I don't know what's happening.
It's okay.
Trump.
I might give you a break, Nancy, because I want to come to Summit,
Okay.
and let me give you a chance actually to address some of the kind of broader context. But I think this is a great kind of laying of the land with regards to, it's a great laying of the land with regards to understanding the real challenges, real big foreign policy challenges that Egypt is going to have to contend with in this context. Yes, it's going along with the Board of Peace, but what does that mean? Yes, it said no to ethnic cleansing, but for how long? I think these are really big questions that the country will have to contend with in 2026. Samar, last but not least, and a reminder to our audience that after Samar answers this question, we're going to turn to your questions, so please bring them in. Samar, on Sunday, we marked, like we said, 15 years since the January 25 revolution in Egypt, and I want to ask you about some of the files that were at the heart of that mobilization today, 15 years later. In 2026, what are some of the big human rights and rule of law issues that Egyptian civil society is monitoring, mobilizing, and advocating around, be it in prisons or outside of prisons? What should we be paying attention to when it comes to understanding Egypt from this 360 perspective?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Tim and Nancy, for their interventions. I think it's really hard to follow this very gloomy situation, gloomy environment, and think about the future in Egypt. When it comes to the human rights issues, I would say that there is one thing that it might be like something to look onto in this specific year, which is the trial referrals. For over 10 years, Egypt had this chronic arbitrary detention problem. And then the president felt a little bit cornered in order to dismantle this. So what he proposed was a criminal procedure code that was supposed to deal with this chronic crisis. But then, ahead of approving this flawed law, what happened is that hundreds, could be thousands also, has been referred to trials in front of terrorism circuits, which means that we cannot guarantee any of the fair trial guarantees. And as we had the longest elections process, we have the highest number of politically motivated trials referrals in the history of Egypt also. So this year we're expecting a lot of sentences against against hundreds or thousands. So this is something that needs a close look. It needs people to monitor it. It needs decision makers to keep an eye on it and gives the indications to the Egyptian government that we are monitoring this and that you have to adhere at least with your own flawed laws. So I would put this at the highest priority. Another thing is the imprisonment conditions itself. Over the past, I think, 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 months, there has been several reports coming out from many human rights organizations documenting horrific violations inside Badr, inside El Asher. We're witnessing people who are on the verge of suicide. There was already suicide attempts, so there is a need for a closer look on this. When the international officials go, like let's say from the EU or from, I don't know if the US send anybody anymore, but when someone goes from the EU, they take them to the new rehabilitation facilities where they show them the new buildings and the new cells, while people are being packed in other cells and being really violated and tortured in many ways. We have also the transnational repression on the rise. Last year, we were witnessing a lot of new trends that the Egyptian regime is using. Pro-regime groups that has been roaming the streets of Europe, UK, and New York, attacking protesters, attacking people in front of the embassies, and the embassies themselves, the staff of the embassies attacked people. We are about to launch our database and report on transnational repression next week. And in this database, there are 70% of the documented cases of people who are their families inside Egypt are almost being kept hostages. 70% are being punished by proxy because of their defenders or journalists in exile work, family members work. So we have the transnational repression there. And we have also the digital repression. I think a few days ago, there was a statement from some of the organization about the migrants, the Syrian migrants and refugees in Egypt. And this sparked an electronic campaign against all the organizations who signed this statement. Although the statement was just documenting what's happening to the Syrians that are being attacked and being forced to be deported from Egypt. For no clear reasons, and in violation to the new law that Egypt was really happy with last year, and the EU also was really happy with. So this digital sphere even is now a new front for repression. It's a new front to attack people. We have also another topic that I would say is very indicative about the civic space in Egypt, the media freedom. In 2017, there were 23 independent websites in Egypt, independent media websites in Egypt. Right now, we have 3 websites, 2 of them inside the country, 1 outside the country, and the 3 are blocked. So it gives an indication about how restrictive, how blocked is the media freedoms in Egypt, and also the access to information. People right to know what's happened, to engage with what's happening on the field. Civic space is still one of the critical issues. Many of the organizations that are registered are facing critical challenges getting approvals from the government about projects, which undermines their work, in addition to the current defunding situation that is already happening for civil society. So this additional bureaucratic process is depriving women rights organizations from implementing projects, from even providing services to women who are facing gender-based violence and other victims. So this is one of the topics. One, I would add one last thing is regarding women's rights. And this is more or less like a call. There are 3 laws, 3 legislations that could create a critical change in the women's rights and family also, family laws in Egypt, which is the personal status law, the comprehensive law against gender-based violence, and the law regarding the committee for combating discrimination. These 3 laws, if the new parliament wants to make a real changes on the social element, we're talking away from politics now, it might create a huge difference. And there are 2 already drafts that has been prepared for over 20 years. Every single parliament discussed the draft. One of them is already in the legislative committee for over 10 years now, but nobody is approving this. Nobody's moving even the drafts along. The issues goes on and on. I don't want to be as gloomy as the situation is, but I think the need for attention is mainly because the international actors' attention to what's happening inside Egypt is decreasing. There is a need for people to step in, for organizations to keep an eye, for independent unions, political parties. I think there is a need right now to shift the advocacy perspective, to go more on a grassroots level, on a people-to-people approach, in order to create support for people in Egypt who are suffering still from authoritarian regime. But the only good thing that the international community is welcoming is that this authoritarian regime right now is serving its purpose. So they're keeping it as it is.
Thanks, Samar. Lots to unpack there. And I think the audience would do well to remember that some of the issues you raised, including poor detention conditions in prison, were at the heart of Egypt's revolution. So important not to forget kind of the context. When we talk about these human rights issues, they're not luxuries. They're deeply related to the sovereignty and stability of the state and its ability to offer citizens an alternative. With that, we're going to turn to your questions. And I see there are already questions from the audience, and please do keep coming them in. I'm going to try to tackle as many questions as I can. I'll take a question, direct it to one of our speakers, and invite any others to jump in as well. Tim, I want to come to you. There was a question on the top foreign policy decisions that Egypt is going to be making in 2026. Maybe let's hear from you and your assessment. What might those be, and what kind of tough decisions beyond the ones that Nancy excellently laid out on Gaza might there be this year?
Sure, thanks. I think there's a major kind of issue that Egypt is grappling with right now is the Saudi-Emirati rivalry that is intensifying in the last month or so, and Egypt appears to pretty clearly be siding with the Saudis at this time. They were already aligned when it came to Sudan, and Egypt's been very frustrated with the Emiratis specifically using their shared partner in eastern Libya, the Haftars, to funnel arms to the RSF there. But at the same time, we've seen from reporting from Metamus that because of Egypt's financial dependency on the Emirates, they had been reluctant to intervene more forcefully. For example, when El Fasher fell and there were horrible massacres that occurred there a couple of months ago. But I think that right now it's how does it navigate a situation where it is coming on the side of one of its patrons and at odds with the other, and these are the two largest kind of patrons for Egypt, while it still hosts a massive development project on its Mediterranean coast that the Emiratis have committed some $35 billion to already. And this is kind of where that double-edged sword comes in. On one level, the Emiratis see this as a strategic thing to be controlling kind of seaways, and so their investment in Ras Al Hikma is aligned with their broader strategy geopolitically. But at the same time, there's no doubt tensions between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and seeing the Egyptians take the Saudi side could create friction in the relationship with Cairo. But I don't know how we're still not sure how that's going to express itself right now because it's so early into the process. But I think navigating that crisis is a major one. I think in addition to that, they're going to try to be positioning themselves to play a role in reconstruction in Gaza to hope to kind of build some economic dividends from that process. But that means that the ceasefire genuinely has to move into further phases as opposed to just rhetorically as we're seeing at the moment. I mean, as Nancy said, we're not getting that kind of we're not getting an actual ceasefire where we're seeing an end to hostilities that can allow for moving into reconstruction, that sort of phase in this process. And finally, I think it's navigating the geopolitical ruptures that are happening on the global level, right? So their Western patrons are also into tensions now, Europe and the United States, and what is that going to mean as global financial assistance is being reduced? The United States, even for all of its kind of bluster about supporting Egypt and wanting to help Sisi, for example, with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, has been very, very restrictive in terms of actual financial support to almost any country at this time, and so there's going to be kind of challenges going forward in terms of being able to sustain external financial support, and I think real question marks as to what it will look like in the Horn of Africa as Trump tries to get more involved. Because there's reports now that the Emiratis are beefing up the Air Force in Ethiopia. Obviously, the last time that Trump tried to help negotiate an end to the dispute over the dam, it ended without an agreement, and the Ethiopians viewing the United States as a partisan of Egypt, and Trump even saying, "I don't know why Sisi didn't bomb the dam when he could." So the tensions could continue to rise, and we have to remember the Horn of Africa has got lots of foreign military interests involved there. Lots of bases, lots of weapons being deployed, lots of sea interests and trade interests. So it's a very high risk of a tinderbox. In addition to the conflicts, right? In Sudan and Ethiopia, both have civil conflicts that are ongoing. So extraordinary risks, as well as Somalia, that has been pulled into this. So there's a lot of turbulence, a lot of risk in an increasingly kind of unrestrained international landscape.
Thanks so much, Tim. Nancy, do you want to come in on this at all? These foreign policy considerations on Egypt's desk?
Yeah, absolutely. It does create, of course, I mean, further vulnerability, as I was saying, and particularly when it comes to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mean, you can see this going into any direction. There is like reconciliation between the two, and just like that, we move past this point, or we find it is like we're going all the way to a complete, I mean, rift that led, for example, the blockade that happened, I mean, and the isolation of Qatar. I think Egypt has an opportunity here, is that like many countries actually are acting in the world right now in response to the precarity that Trump is bringing, is to hedging their way in, and I'm talking here politically mainly, but even if it's symbolically, and Egypt has cleverly done that in the past, it's just like signaling some rapprochement and signaling approachment to China, and then signaling that, I mean, there are like some agreements and on the way with India and other countries, and like relating more to the global south. I mean, I'm not saying that this is a solution, but actually what Egypt could do and should do, and other countries as well, is to stick to supporting the international institutions. And also it played with that card before, like with the ICJ. Every time the pressure increased on Egypt for the displacement of Sinai, like the Sisi would just like wave the card of like joining the ICJ case, I mean, like, which recognizes like the genocide in Gaza. And there is going to be a very crucial direction for all countries, and not Egypt only, but also in Egypt in particular, with a situation. I mean, as Tim said, like maybe the UAE would not withdraw its investments, but it can create a very difficult, precarious situation for Egypt because of its alignment with Saudi Arabia, if Egypt continues to be aligned with Saudi Arabia as well. So I think, I mean, again, like back to the basics, I mean, there's little someone can do with such a precarity. There's also, this is the accumulated outcome of the complete dependency, lack of sovereignty, and the dismissal of domestic legitimacy, and just relying that we have Saudi Arabia and UAE backing us. And this is the situation you find yourself in, where your internal legitimacy is completely destroyed, and you are just like left to the whims of the different international leadership that is changing, and reconciliation and that.
Thank you, Nancy. Samar, I want to come to you with a question. There's someone who asked about the tensions that might exist between the fact that there's a deep lack of space for civil society activism and also frustration at the unsustainability of the economy. Does this mean at all that we should be thinking about how to mobilize and organize around economic rights? What's the gap there? What should civil society be thinking about in order to better connect and respond to the needs of Egyptians on the ground?
I think what happened last year in Morocco and in, I think, Colombia, there were 7 countries where people, like the younger generation, Gen Z, went out in the streets protesting against specifically social and economic issues. In Morocco, it was mainly about public spending and how it has been allocated, or they want it to be reallocated. So it gives us an indication that public anger, it might be clear right now in Egypt as groups that are gathering and waving this raving in the streets, but it might spark in a second, because the level of irrationality of public spending in Egypt and the way that people see how the resources are allocated in places where they don't have any clear they don't get any clear benefit from, it will spark an anger. When January 25 happened, what sparked it was a small incident that happened in Alexandria, that of torture. So there are small things that happens and that might spark the fire. I think there are several, I would say, features of this anger. You can see it in the TikTok videos on social media. You can see it in people posts on social media. There are several indications, and maybe that's why the state is kind of repressing the digital sphere more and more right now in Egypt, attacking people, arresting people from TikTok and from social media platforms, because they feel like if people actually can gather themselves on Discord, which is another legal case that is happening already in Egypt, people got arrested because of trying to make groups on Discord. So there are a need that people started already to reflect their need to gather to talk more about social and economic rights, and the gaps that is happening in the social protection policies in social protections programs in Egypt would even escalate this more. And I think the new parliament, there are some voices that has been assigned inside this parliament that might echo what the social and economic issues that people are suffering from, and they need to step in and talk more about the redistribution of the budget and about more accountability. The definition of fiscal transparency itself has to be there on the table in Egypt in the upcoming years in order to avoid a new wave of revolution. As someone who participated in the first one, I wouldn't be sad if there is a second one. But anyway, if the regime wants to avoid this, there has to be a clearer, more attention to social and economic problems in Egypt.
Thanks, Samar. And I think Tim wants to come in on this. Tim, you've done some thinking about also the role of civil society, which has really left social and economic rights to the government often, or to government NGOs, depriving us of, as an independent movement, of the space to really organize and offer an alternative. And I'm curious what you might want to add here.
Thanks. I think that especially earlier on, there was a lot of kind of focus on political and civil rights, and there kind of was this growing gap where the population felt the pain of the economic deterioration much more acutely initially, or we're prioritizing that because it's, at the end of the day, feeding your kids, keeping a roof above them is kind of the ultimate priority for parents and for people trying to take care of their families. And so there felt like there was this disconnect where a lot of the things that they were hearing on the rights front weren't talking about their primary struggles. But I think we are seeing more and more organizations take an interest in social and economic rights as of late, looking at the intersections in terms of the rights of migrants and refugees, looking at it in terms of people's access to health, access to food, access to housing. And I think that more of that is necessary to kind of remind the population that rights have everything to do with the issues that they're most concerned about when it comes to their ability to feed their families, take care of them, access healthcare, and then also to take the next step and indicate that governance, that transparency, that combating corruption, and having a free press that can actually provide information to the public, to the market, to investors. All these things are interlinked with the economic struggles that they're actually experiencing. And if we can take that next step where people can really see holistically how governance and rights are quite fundamental to the success of the economy in the medium to long term, I think that is also going to be a powerful way to kind of rebuild recognition of the importance of rights in the conversation about what Egypt needs and what kind of reforms are necessary. And if I could have just one more minute on this foreign policy discussion and kind of Egypt's triangulation, and just one last thing I wanted to note that I think is quite interesting about Egypt historically and up until this day, they have been remarkably adept at juggling patrons who are rivals and exploiting their rivalries to continue to extract rents at a limited cost. And this is true going back to Nasser, between the Soviets and the Americans, all until Sisi. I mean, if we can recall that after Russia invaded Ukraine, Egypt was caught trying to sell artillery to the Russians, and the Biden administration, got them to stop, but then they refused to give that artillery or sell that artillery to the Ukrainians. It didn't disrupt Western support for Egypt, because in all of these situations, all these parties are worried about losing what they see as a geostrategic asset, or being kind of overshadowed by their rivals if they have a stronger relationship with Cairo. And as a result, Egypt is allowed to kind of draw on that concern to bring in a lot of support. I mean, Europe's loans to Egypt are just to be in the room. I mean, they have really secured no strategic kind of objectives in their support for Egypt at all. But the mere desperation of relevance really kind of explains their involvement there, and fear of collapse. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And we'll see, though, if the Emiratis are as comfortable looking the other way as some of these other parties have been historically, if these tensions continue to intensify.
Thanks, Tim. Nancy, I'm going to come to you with a question about BRICS, actually, and then I'm going to give Tim a chance as well. There's a question in here about whether you, as an expert, feel that Egypt benefited in any way from its membership in the BRICS bloc and in the new BRICS New Development Bank, whether economically or geopolitically. Kind of what's the conversation been around that? Nancy, if you want to go first.
Okay, I have to give a disclaimer. I mean, I'm no expert on this, so I mean, I usually avoid talking about things I'm not like following closely, but symbolically and politically. I mean, again, one of the things that is a challenge for a lot of countries that are caught between the great power competition is to be able to show that there is an alternative structure, that there is another way. Joining the BRICS, I mean, symbolically, yes, I mean, and many of the countries actually who join it for that reason, because as far as I mean, like, see today, I mean, like the power of the dollar, I mean, and the US economy is unmatched. I mean, even if we include China and other economies, and there's a big debate about that. However, I mean, it's just like, it is important to note that this moment is like the moment of disruption that we are seeing right now can create a crisis, but also an opportunity. When we see Egypt signaling that they are joining other organizations or groups, I mean, and like the Global South kind of forms of coalition, that's symbolically important, but we cannot be, I mean, under any illusion that that can substitute for what the relationship between the United States can offer or can harm Egypt. But again, like, it's just like, this is symbolic. However, also there's something else. I mean, like, I was in Cape Town after the G20, and one of the delegates mentioned is like, everyone was proud that, I mean, like, there was a charter, I mean, like a communique that came out even despite the absence of the United States from the G20. And someone just like candidly said, like, this is great, we can make all those statements, but this is a sideshow. And as long as we continue to work without having real power, it's always going to be in the realm of statements that are more symbolic than actual. I think, I mean, even though it relates to international affairs, that Egypt's best bet is to, I mean, kind of strengthen and improve the legitimacy internally and domestically. And Sisi has gained a bit of like political capital with his position on Sinai, and a lot of people, even the adversarial ones and some of the dissent, acknowledge that. He could take this opportunity and make certain changes that would not be at high political cost for him. Like, for example, I mean, like the issues with tortures and prison and other things that even economically that Tim had mentioned, that would not threaten his position. It will not come at a political cost, but at the same time put him in a position where Egypt does not be in the same, like, this wind and storm that is happening around it. I agree with Tim that Egypt has been able to hedge its way, I mean, all along since Nasser. At the same time, we need to see, like, the world today, I mean, as of January 2025, the calculus has changed for everyone. Even what the European has taken for granted is now something that is really, and we can learn from them. I mean, it's like the European Union, for example, announced today that the big trade agreement with India, and showing how that this does mean that they are turning their back to the United States. They're not, but it's also, these are signals that we can actually survive without the big guys in the room, like making this, like, determining our destiny in a way.
Thanks, Nancy. The points about what Sisi could do to kind of release some of the pressures are very interesting ones. Thanks for pointing those out. Tim, did you have anything to add on this BRICS question?
Yeah, I completely agree with Nancy on it being largely symbolic. And I would add, I think the fundamentals don't really get addressed in terms of Egypt's economic problems with BRICS. So, for example, they were touting the fact that their trade with BRICS countries, the volume of trade increased by 20% after joining BRICS, but 80% of the trade is imports. And Egypt's fundamental problem is that it imports more than it exports, that it consumes more dollars and more hard currency than it's able to bring in. And so it has this constant, what's called the current account deficit. It has this constant need to borrow to fill that gap. And so the relationship with BRICS is no different than its relationship with the world in general, which is that it's largely taking in more than it can support. And so building up its domestic productivity is fundamentally important for its ability to kind of balance its trade relationship. And I think the BRICS thing kind of reminds me a bit about all the times that after Obama was critical of Sisi early on in his administration, he brought in Putin and he covered the streets with signs for Putin. And they even on the front page of Al Ahram had Putin, a bunch of photos, including him topless in the woods. And then, the State Department is asking if, is Russia going to, come in and replace us? And I'm like, with what money? I don't understand what they play this game. And there's fundamentally a lot of this is symbolic. And I mean, Egypt wants its external partners to worry that it has lots of options. But again, which options actually have the resources that Egypt needs? That's a narrower group of countries and institutions.
Thanks, Tim. As we prepare to wrap up, I want to do closing remarks from each of you. And I think we've talked about a lot of really difficult files that are in Egypt's disk in 2026, be it what it will do in Gaza, be it the role that it will continue to play in Sudan and what this means for the Horn of Africa and GERD issues. We've talked about some of the real economic challenges that are, yes, the indicators tell a slightly different story, but the lived experiences matter just as much. And we've talked about some of the real human rights and rule of law challenges that for the most part have been unaddressed or the goalposts have shifted. And so the country does not have an easy year before it. Authorities have a lot of difficult questions to reflect on, but I want to try to be a little bit more forward thinking. And I want to ask each of our speakers in just a minute each, where do you see, as an advocate, a policy expert, a scholar, an opportunity for either Egyptian civil society or Egyptian authorities to make a tangible impact? If you could pick one file where you see this is something where we can actually see positive progress for the better of Egypt. And we will do Samar, then Nancy, then Tim, and close out the event. Samar?
Well, I'm trying to be hopeful now. So let me imagine. Well, I think right now the Egyptian regime in a position that it hasn't been in ever since the beginning of Sisi's era. In the beginning, he felt neglected, isolated, and rejected by the international community. Right now, he is welcomed He is loved by many. So maybe this is a moment where he can act more confident, more assured. Mubarak went through the same. First 10 years were very harsh, very repressive, and then things started to loosen up a little bit. I wouldn't call it like a real democracy, but then maybe this is a moment where President Sisi can feel confident enough to loosen the repression a little bit, to give indications that there will be gradual reform in Egypt. Egypt is too fragile to have any sudden movements right now. So I would say maybe an indication would be like dismantling once and for all the problem of the political prisoners in Egypt that has been hanging on for years. Another thing would be dealing with sorry, transnational oppression is at the core of my heart. So allowing Egyptians abroad to renew their identity documents and register their newborns. So it might give an indication to people inside and outside that there is an opening, and let's wait and see and hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Samar. And needless to say, also one of Egypt's greatest capitals is its people, and so assets is its people. And so being for Egyptians abroad to be able to connect with the country is extremely important, not just socially, but also economically. Nancy?
Yeah, I echo what Samar said, and also add to this something just to identify where the threat is coming from Egypt. And I'm saying Egypt as a country and also the regime itself, which is trying to all the time struggle to preserve itself. Egypt has not been most threatened, and the regime itself, when there are international turmoil, even in the region, because the best gift to an authoritarian regime is the external enemy. Egypt has always terrified Sisi in his speeches, always freak out when there's turmoil domestically in other countries that people may look at and see change is happening. I mean, he had like this famous speech that he had after Syrian takeover and the ouster of or the fleeing of Bashar al-Assad, and he just like came out without anyone telling him. It was like, I don't have blood on my hands. And the same thing also when it happened, like the recent wave of demonstrations and protests in Iran. I mean, and it didn't only freak out, I mean, the Egyptian regime, but also other regimes in the country too. We reached the irony that it is Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, they're the ones who are putting pressure on Trump not to bomb Iran, because for them, like the chaos there is a direct threat to them. So flipping this on its side and just saying is like, then what we need to do basically is to expand our ability to increase like the margins and demands for more rights and freedoms in Egypt. Once that we can negotiate with the regime, because it will need to gain some legitimacy for that. And again, like I mentioned, just a few things. The other thing that I hope that we need.
And Nancy, we're running out of time. So just 30 seconds.
Just one thing really quickly. The civil society in Egypt working on foreign policy. We don't have that. We have civil society working on domestic issues. And when it comes to working on international affairs, it's only from the human rights perspective. It would be really crucial to see this vacuum filled by Egyptian civil society that are not, I mean, associated with the state.
Wonderful. And Tim, very quickly.
I think taking a page from you and investing in Egypt's greatest asset, its people, would be something that it would be welcomed by Egyptians if they saw more social protection, more spending on health and education. It would be better for the economy. It would help grow the economy. And it's also something that the IMF, the European Union, the World Bank all say they want to see. And it would also stabilize the situation politically and contribute to the legitimacy gap that Nancy referred to. The main thing that Egyptians have been angry with Sisi about before everything else is how bad their economic situation is. And if he can deliver relief on that front, it would be better for everybody, including him.
Wonderful. Lots to think of there. Thank you, Nancy, Tim, and Samar, for an extremely rich discussion. The hour and a half went by so quickly. I really appreciate your thoughtful insights. You've left us all with a lot to reflect on. Thank you to our audience for your questions and your curiosities. You, of course, made the conversation so much more dynamic. And of course, thank you to the Time Up team that helped make this event possible. Time Up has, of course, been programming on Egypt since day one when we were founded in February 2013, almost exactly 13 years ago. And you can expect to see continued Egypt programming this year on issues like law and governance, inclusive economies, Egypt's foreign policy, and of course, with a particular focus on the role in Gaza. Be sure you're subscribed to our listserv and find us on the social media channels that you're most active. We look forward to continuing the conversation and hosting you at the next event. Thank you all.